All right. So, welcome to our special episode today in this memorial episode of our podcast of Hands Off, Hands On. We want to dedicate this to celebrating a former member of our AMP community, Phil Tygiel, and his life and his legacy. And so, we invited some special friends of his to have a conversation together today to really think about his life, his legacy as a distinguished professional, but not just as a professional, as a mentor, as a friend and an inspiration to many. So, in our episode today, we're going to hear a little bit more from each of the individuals that we've invited to share their memories, reflection on his journey, his achievements, and definitely the marks that he left on our profession, maybe even specific to AOMPT. So, whether you knew Phil personally or professionally, maybe just learning about him the first time, we invite you to join us in this legacy, understanding his influence, finding inspiration and dedication from his spirit and his passion. And I just want to say thank you to our panelists today that for sharing their stories and their heartfelt time in remembering Phil. So thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it. So I'm going to kick us off with 6 questions, and I certainly would love to have some just back and forth conversations with you guys, hearing more about your interactions with Phil over the years. And we're going to kind of go chronologically. So starting from the beginning, so maybe you can first share some of your first memories that you had of Phil, and maybe how he began or how your interactions began with Phil in physical therapy. So anyone can kick us off here.
So I would probably be the last in line, but I think my first memory kind of interacting with Phil was interesting. It was probably at AOMPT actually, and I was at the conference, and it was just one of those. I was maybe like 2 years out as a new PT going to this conference for the first time. And Phil was just like stuck to my side the whole time of the conference. And I'm like, who is this guy? Other than I knew him a little bit, and that he and I both practiced in Tucson. But I think that just that experience of here's this guy that has been involved with the APTA and even AM for such a long time. And to have him be right next to me explaining things, talking to me about what was happening at the conference and just the bigger, broader context of what's going on, I think was emblematic of his whole career. And so this was probably like 2015 or something like that. But I know, the other two have experience with Phil going, a lot further back than that. So I'm interested to hear kind of those experiences.
Bill?
Yeah, Phil, I go back probably about 30 years or so. I was with the academy kind of at the beginning. I was one of the first of the four original examiners prior to back when Barb Stevens was the exam chair, and Phil was our rules of Roberts guy. The guy was. He was so on top of things. He was so smart. I mean, I don't know how you can keep track of all of this kind of stuff. And Phil was always, Phil's a little younger than I am, but we always end up seeming to hook up, during the breaks or after, or Phil was always arranging dinners and stuff, and great sense of humor. He was involved in in a lot of the stuff that was going on in Arizona. He mentored a lot of people. And he was responsible for a lot of the stuff that later occurred in as far as the advancement of physical therapy, the Open Practice Act, and things like this. He was in the House of Delegates, so he always had something insightful to say. When it was like when he some people can open their mouth and stuff doesn't come out right. Phil was always one of these guys that was just a kind of a sage. When he'd make a comment, I mean, it was well thought out. He was a very organized and well thought out human being. We had some great times together, drank together and, socialized, and, we would sit up late outside, like at CSM and some of the other places. And, he'd always have his hard liquor. I was always with, I had beer. I couldn't keep up with a guy like that, but just a great guy, we got closer as, as the years passed, we got closer, and he invited me to a celebration of life. And that tore me up, but he had told me a year ago that, he was having problems, he had cancer and stuff. And this is before he started to decline. And, when I went and saw him at his celebration of life, and, one thing that didn't change with him, he was always positive. He was always deflecting, I would say, deflecting praise on other people. He was a very selfless guy, and he was always so pro PT. It was always in just, and you listen to the people that were there that had praised him, and it was just amazing the amount of people that were at this thing. Anyway, I've said enough. So
I love that.
let's.
Colette?
Well, like Seth, I met Phil first at my first conference, and it was before the conference at a deli. And I don't even know how he knew I was a physical therapist. And I didn't know he was a physical therapist. And I thought, who is this guy? And, and I see him at the conference, and he's attached to me the whole day, the whole conference. And, he invited me to dinner with the group of people that he was arranging. And, it just like brought me in. And I wasn't going to go to the business meeting because I was kind of tired. And he goes, no, the business meeting is the best part. And, he was really right. Like, this is where things happens at AAOMPT, and, decisions are to be made. And he just kind of included me there, and we kept in touch. And randomly he would call and say, hey, the APTA needs this, and I volunteered you, so you're it. And I mean, like, how do you volunteer people for these positions? Always super positive and so present in everything he did. And every time you're talking to him, you just felt like you were the only one. And I know he did that with so many people. That's what made it so magical. And, like at the last conference, it was really tough because he wasn't there. And in 15 or 16 years of, hanging out together, and I just looked for people who looked lost.
Yeah.
And I just put that in my memory, like, people who are new, to bring him in,
Yeah.
It's so inspirational in everything he did.
Well, and that just totally resonates, you and Seth's story, but then turn around and have Bill hanging out with him for a while doing the same thing, which is just total authentic connection, right? I mean, and that he took you out, took you to get you under the arm and in the wing, and just hung out with you. And Bill, if you can hang out with him, you got to drink with him, right? That's sometimes the conference life. And he definitely did it well. And so I truly appreciate your three stories, and see a lot of similarities already showing in the way that Phil's life really was, right? Totally professional, connected, willing to take risks and meet new people. And sometimes we don't get out of our own shell. So I love that. I'd like to take this a little further, and I want to ask you, is there a particular moment that stuck out to you in interactions with him, or something that was just really meaningful that you would want to share with the audience?
I'd say, there was a lot of incidents where Phil stood out, and at the meetings, he was he'd bring up stuff that none of us, even thought about. I mean, in the back of our minds, but he verbalized a lot of the stuff that we were thinking. And he was just he was a very inspirational guy. I mean, but there wasn't a single incident that I can name, specifically. There was a lot of incidents. I mean, that I saw him in action, and when I first met him, I didn't know much about him and stuff. We got to know each other, probably even more socially, because he would always invite, he'd always set up these things to invite different groups of people to dinner. And he was a very he had a great sense of humor, and he and I found out later in life that I was part Jewish, and so that was another thing that he and I had in common. I said I was a member of the tribe, and so we got a kick out of we'd use Jewish sayings between each other, like Mazel Tov, and I'd call them a mensch, but it wasn't just one thing with Phil as far as my experience with him. He was very supportive of the organizations that he belonged to, and he took an active participation. He wasn't somebody that you're going to see sitting on the sidelines. And that's, you got to admire. A lot of people are very, very bashful getting up and talking. Phil was never bashful.
I love that.
So many things like Bill said that just really stuck out to me. But really, like, two things was his attitude about burnout and physical therapy. And he always said, physical therapists who burn out were never lit. He's just so passionate about the profession, all the way throughout his life, really. And one of the last trips he did was in November. He went to India on a trip that was designed for physical therapists, occupational therapists, other healthcare providers, and to see him, like, in some ways, like, work the room, right? But like such deep connection that people in that group just really loved him and appreciated him. And he just worked with everybody to, like, inspire them in their own area and encourage them. I mean, just at a time where he was really, in some ways physically weakening, but the rest of him was just, like, still as passionate as ever.
Love that.
I mean, it's interesting because sometimes as you get older, I've observed in your career, you get a little more stuck in your ways. And it was interesting to see the opposite almost happen with Phil, where he was constantly trying to push the profession forward. So one of the things he said to me that I remember as I was early in my career as a delegate was, if you have a motion and it passes because everyone votes for it, it was a bad motion. And that made me think what he was saying was, it should have been passed a long time ago. And what we really need are people to look into the future and maybe come up with some motions that are maybe a little controversial. Maybe they don't pass the first time or two, but they get people thinking. So that was something I've kind of mulled over since then. And then during a few conferences, we'd go back and forth about different opinions on he was just a strong believer in the profession in general, and that patients don't get to physical therapy fast enough, or that we don't end up seeing a lot of the patients that we can help. And so a lot of his career, especially towards the end, was devoted towards that. And you can see his work there. But we'd go back and forth about the quality of physical therapy. So I'm kind of a strong believer, and it matters the skill that physical therapist has and the knowledge. And he was maybe less convinced of that. He just wanted people to get to PT. So we had a few lively discussions about that.
I love that. He would probably like the house this year, you all. There's a lot of primary care conversations going on, and getting patients into care, obviously a little faster, and looking at ways to do that. I was in the house with Phil quite a bit, and just obviously my roles. He was a parliamentarian for Aon for like ever, and by the way, that is not a skill set that most people like to have. But the fact that he had that, I think, made him. I always called it a double threat in the house, because if you know how to work the room and you know policy procedures, like he was well skilled in terms of how to handle the house. And so I loved his lively discussions. I loved his contributions always. And I called him, again, you have to find people in the room who are comfortable poking the bear. And he was comfortable poking the bear. And I appreciated that about him. He would definitely ask questions. And so I hear that again in your stories where, his passion resonated and you felt it. And so again, Colette's saying, if you were burned out, you were never lit. He was lit all the way till the very end, right? He was very passionate, and we all benefited for sure. Oh, I want to ask another question if it's okay. I want to hear a little bit more about, what do you know that he struggled with, or what challenge did he have to overcome, maybe throughout his career, or maybe something that you're aware of that he would want people to know, that this really was something that he was passionate to serve or to overcome. Maybe he didn't overcome it yet. Obviously, we know his some of his end times are very challenging, but he still handled them with great grace. But any other stories that you have about his life and challenges that maybe he overcame that would help our audience get to know him a little better?
I don't know if this was a huge challenge, but when I interviewed Phil a little while ago, he talked to me about the beginning of his career and how he started in Tucson at TMC, even though he's a New Yorker. He said he realized that was a mistake of birth, which I thought was a great quote. So he moved out west and ended up in Tucson. And he did comment how he felt like he was lucky and that he ended up in Tucson Medical Center down here at a time where there were some other physical therapists who were kind of hungry to learn, but that outside of that, kind of the maybe connection of with the larger association wasn't as much there. And then later on he's commented about how that has kind of become more of a glaring issue. I think you see this nationally where just and we could list off a whole lot of problems with the profession, but that's one of them. I think where these local meetings have kind of died out in a lot of instances. We're definitely seeing that in Arizona.
Right.
And so that was another thing he kind of, that maybe came full circle a little bit in his life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you, Seth. I do see that was being one of his major struggles, was not really a personal struggle. I think his struggle was like the profession as a whole and helping it advance to really become what it should be. And that was so evident. And one of the ways he addressed it was like, at the local level and the national level, and being really involved and being really the ultimate networker and really bringing in other people to help that grow. And, he told me things that he did in Arizona. And I used to always beg him, please, please come out to California. We need you. Um, but, that I think, I mean, I did see him struggle toward the end of like his time, like when we were, especially in India. Like I had seen him in the summer in August, and I heard about the trip, and I realized I'm gonna go. And I didn't realize how much weaker he had gotten physically. Um, but like he just took it in stride. He's like, I know this is what I need to do. I know this is what I need, how I need to adapt. And then in my mind, like every walking surface in India is made out of high polished marble, and he's on crutches. I'm like, oh my gosh, but he was just taking it all in stride, because I don't think that was his struggle. I think his struggle was more of like the perspective of the profession and how does he make an impact. And yeah.
Love that.
Phil, the thing about Phil, I don't know if you call us a challenge or not, but just the way that he was driven. He was a lifelong learner. He was a voracious reader. I taught with Lori Hartman for about 20 years, and I had a bunch of, I invited, this was an invite only to Las Vegas. And, I invited Phil, and, he was so excited about being able to sit down. We had, Joe Farrell and, Greg Johnson, really pretty heavy duty people from all over the country that were personal friends. And, Phil was there, and somebody had mentioned that he would attach himself to somebody. And we had one of my fellowship students, Sarah Anderson, was there, and Phil kind of hung with her. And, when Sarah found out that Phil was dying, I mean, it hit her pretty hard, because their relationship was kind of a funny relationship. It was very it was a very friendly relationship, and I think Sarah at times was intimidated by Phil. But she was very, she expressed her sadness when she found out about Phil. And then I know this is a little veering off a little bit from the topic, but one of the things that really impressed me is when I went to his memorial. It actually wasn't. It was a celebration of life, and this is Phil. This is typical Phil. He was his. I don't want to have to celebrate after I'm dead. I want to be able to, you know,
He went to have the party before.
yeah. And I mean, this is so Phil. He was such a social animal. And then listening to all of these people pay homage to this guy. I mean, and the amount of the people, I mean, some really heavy duty people in our field and that had paid tribute to Phil at this thing. I was so impressed. I was kind of blown away that, um, the people that he knew, and the people who had listened to the stories that people had said um, about him, and I went out and I talked to him, and he was pretty weak by this time, but he was, he got up from his chair and he gave just a great speech, and he said, this is not a celebration just of my life; it's a celebration of our life. And it's also a celebration of yours, And I was like, I'm about ready to cry. I mean, and it was so inspiring to listen to him. Anyway, that like I said, he was a lifelong learner, and any way that he could, learn something new, he was all in.
Yeah. And you kind of took us in the direction that I'd love to go next, which is obviously knowing him, having been maybe mentored by or being good colleagues with him. What are the aspects of his mentorship style that really made him so compelling to either follow, listen to, or be mentored by, which made him so memorable? You say social, but what does that mean? Why was he so good at that social connection? What was it about him that made it so personable and easy to follow?
He he was one of these guys that would sit down with you. He didn't have to know you very well, but he was very inclusive, and he would sit down he had some kind of a sixth sense about, when he would talk to people, and want to bring them into the fold. And he would meet people that he had never met before, and he would sit there and talk with them and stuff, and kind of fill them in, and with encouragement, and give them the lowdown on things. This is why we're doing this, and provide some history, supply some background on things, and get people interested. And he just had a way about him that made you gravitate toward him, especially if you were a younger PT. He just had this this sense about him that you knew that he was kind of a go-to guy, and so people kind of gravitated toward him.
That's great.
Yeah, I think we kind of alluded to it a few times. I mean, I think he had a personality that was very outgoing, and so he would end up reaching out to everyone. I mean, if you're like kind of sitting next to him, he'd start talking to you, which I think, and we didn't talk about this in terms of challenges, but I think, I didn't hear him talk much about this, but I think one maybe challenges, he did have that sort of personality that could be abrasive. If you're at a conference and you're, didn't sleep too well the night before, and here's Phil talking your ear off. All right, So I think, but he just kept going, and I think that was, emblematic again of his life, where he, didn't care too much. He'd just keep on going and do what Phil did and keep reaching out to people. So that was the personality he had, outgoing. He'd always be reaching out and getting people involved.
Tenacious, it sounds like, willing to keep doing the hard things and just keep on plugging away, right? So that's awesome. Colette?
I think it's because really, like, deeply, you could just sense he cared. He cared about, like, when he's talking to you, he cares about you as a person. And all the other people I've ever spoken to and was around, is especially like towards the end of life celebration, people just, they expressed how much that he had encouraged them, and just how much, like, love he really shared for people. But like sometimes he was a little abrasive. And I remember sitting at a conference one time, and I don't know all the details, but I just remember he kind of leaned over and whispered, "I'm really proud of you." And like that was after years of like putting myself out there and doing all this. Like he wasn't flowery, in any way, but he just really cared. And I think, like, emulated as like a physical therapist in general, like we care about our patients, right? We want to help them do the best they possibly can, and we pour out into them. Like, we learn and try to figure out challenging patients. And I think he did that with everybody that he came across.
Yeah. Well, and not just in our world in AOMPT, right? Throughout the profession, his years in APTA and in AOMPT, he's a man who is definitely invested and willing to make those connections. And so, I appreciate your insight in that area, because finding somebody to follow and to sit beside and lead with at times, it takes a certain personality. And certainly Phil led a lot of things and was willing to take those charges. And so I believe he's a leader of our profession in a lot of ways. And obviously, with the connections he built, he was effective in doing those things. So I think it's what I took away from your stories there. So thank you. I want to hear one more thing, and this is a little bit more about the legacy in the future. So, what advice or insights from Phil that maybe you received are the most valuable for the future professionals that you would want to tell today? What is the one or two things that you felt like it just instilled from your time with Phil that would be worthwhile for our audience to hear?
I don't know if he said this specifically, but I think it was implied with his behavior, and I think one is dedication to your profession. Two, share your knowledge, and make make your lifelong a lifelong learning situation. And I guess the last one is just stay humble. Um, he, I think Phil lived his life to the fullest. This guy, some people, look at being healthy and happy and just dying suddenly. Phil rode hard, beat up and slid into home plate with beat up and worn out, but what a life. He did it his way.
That's great.
And you got to admire a guy like that. I mean, you just the celebration of life and stuff, and I mean, he did it his way, and he lived his life to the fullest, going to India when he was terminally ill. I mean, who does this? I mean, this was Phil.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I really learned from him was that you have to have the long game approach. Like, I think Seth alluded to that as well. Like, okay, if it gets passed on the first round, then it was too late coming, right? He would put things out there, and he would always say, like, after, a meeting or something, like, we still need to work on this, but it'll be working towards that now because we've brought it up, we've had a conversation. Like, he was always looking, like, not where we want to be right now, but he had a vision, like, where things should be, like, especially, like, politically, like, in Tucson, like, where are we now, where do we want to be in 5 years and 10 years. They were the first with some of the things that other states in the country really struggled with, but it was because of a long game and a commitment and a perseverance. Um, and and also at the same time having on the other balance side, like at the AAOMPT parties, at some of the APTA parties, he was the first to let loose and have fun, like on the dance floor, making silly pictures in the selfie booth, like at the same time doing these things that were super fun, just like enjoying every single moment of it.
Yeah, I think there'd be two things. The one for me that I think seems obvious is to take an active role in your profession, um, for multiple reasons. It not only does it help the profession, but it will help fulfill you in terms of your career and satisfaction with being able to connect and get involved. And then the other thing is just like we've kind of alluded to, the importance of friendship and making an effort to strengthen your friendships, because I think that's really challenging to do these days. Everyone's kind of disconnected a little bit, although we're all connected through our cell phones and computers. And so he was really, really good at building friendships with people. I mean, he had friendships and people, at his celebration of life that showed up from, you know,
All over.
all over the country. I think there was a person that came from outside of the US. So, I mean, it was just amazing.
Yeah. All right. So here's my pop quiz for the day. I always have to have something to throw you a little bit. So, one word that describes Phil. Your word for Phil.
Passion.
I would have to use the word mensch.
What you got, Seth?
I think I'm going to go with excitable.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So I have to thank you guys for sharing your heartfelt stories with our audience, and I hope that they were able to walk away learning a little bit more about a great man that will be deeply missed, not just from our organization, but from the profession. And, when you look at your life, you always think about what's your legacy. And I think when you look at the three of you, knowing that his legacy will be survived in a way through your passion and the people you connect, and hopefully through the audience and others that know him well, I think that we will forever be indebted to Phil's legacy and what he committed his life to serve. And so I hope that others can hear his contributions, his dedication to excellence, even though he might fight about a little bit whether the excellence matters or not, Seth. More access or excellence, I don't know. It's a debate, right? But what you heard was that it was always PT, and that he loved his profession and wanted to make sure the patients had the best type of care. And so I just, in our memorial episode, want to say thank you to you all for your time. And I want to just say Phil will be greatly missed. His spirits and contributions will be forevermore, will guide and inspire us. We will miss him doing our parliamentary procedures because nobody knows it like Phil did. Um, but we will miss him every AAOMPT. It's just the time that we'll join together and we'll toast to him. But in the meantime, I hope that all of you found a little bit of comfort in knowing that his spirit is still alive and well within all of you. So I'll wrap us up and thank you guys for listening to the podcast and the hands-on, hands-off episode in which we dedicated some time to just getting to know a little bit more about the man, Phil Tygiel, and knowing that he will be greatly missed.
Thanks a lot.